Yeah, this 1.5-day workshop covered a whole range of topics. We had a total of 6 presentations. But I think the key things that came out of it were, first of all, we need to be very clear what we mean by social inclusion and related issues, because if we all have a different idea in our mind, it's difficult really to focus on solutions and to solve the problem. So the first thing is to be clear what the issue is we're trying to address. The second thing then is, in order to make progress, we need to find ways of measuring what we're trying to deal with. So what are the indicators that actually show where there is social exclusion or where there is poverty and so on. And we need those measures both in order to be able to identify the seriousness and extent of the problem spatially as well as in other ways, but also so that when we do come up with solutions, we can actually test whether those solutions have been effective or not. And that's another important area, that we need to fully understand what people experience and what their problems are before we can come up with tailor-made solutions. And we got a lot of good ideas from the Roundtable, but also a caution that one size won't fit all, that there are cultural differences, there are differences in stage of economic development. So while some of the principles might be applicable, we have to be very sensitive in applying them to make sure they will fit in that cultural, that geographical, that political context and so on. The next thing really is, having identified possible solutions, it's then a question of making a business case. How do you get funding for it, whether it's the investment funding or the recurrent funding for revenue and so on. And that requires actually having a very clear sense of what it's going to achieve and how you can make an argument for it. And I think we recognise that perhaps there are areas of appraisal that need strengthening. We're very good, for example, at justifying major road schemes and things like that. We've had decades of understanding their benefits, but when it comes down to the subtleties of the different ways in which certain groups are excluded through money or time or location, we perhaps don't fully understand those issues and therefore what the benefits are going to be of dealing with those. So, for example, we heard in one of our papers that by providing subsidised public transport, people were not only better able to access jobs, but their average wage increased as well. That was a real benefit, which obviously fed through to the local community. So we need to understand appraisal much better. And I think the other area that came out very strongly is the fact that we work in silos. We think of a transport problem, we think of a housing problem, but these things are actually very closely interlinked. And if we want to make real progress in dealing with exclusion and related issues, we have to join these things up together to recognise that it's not simply about providing somebody with a clean, safe place to live. It's got to be something that's accessible to employment that they can take up. It's got to be accessible to education, to health and things like that. So we need more of a livelihood approach, not simply thinking about where people live in isolation. And that comes down to 2 related issues as well. One is the question of joining things up, because central governments particularly are very siloed, and we found in country after country, both in developed and developing countries, that they seem incapable of actually joining up transport and land use. A very fundamental thing, but obviously there's a basic structural problem there in terms of governance, administration and so on. And we think those issues are quite crucial really. And linked to that is the whole question of incentivisation. Different ministries and government departments have different rationale for doing things that often pull them in opposite directions rather than pull them in the same direction. And because poorer people tend to be more dependent on the state for welfare, education, etc., where different policies from different departments pull apart, it's often the poor that really get caught in the middle more than wealthier people who are able to buy their own goods and services and therefore operate within a much more flexible system. And then finally, I think we recognise that while the subject of the Roundtable is clearly around social exclusion, a lot of the solutions that we think are necessary actually have all sorts of other benefits as well. And we're not going to justify them simply in terms of their poverty reduction benefits. But if we can start joining up on our side in terms of identifying issues as well as on the delivery side, then we can come up with more comprehensive business cases that cut across a whole range of improvements that would result. And as a result of that, being able to tap into more funding sources and actually tackle these bigger problems in a much more integrated way.